She had 60 days to save everything, then a stranger arrived and changed it all. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which Helen would later think was cruel. Tuesdays had no right to carry that kind of weight. Mondays, maybe. Mondays were built for disaster. But Tuesday morning, with the coffee still hot and Lily singing something tuneless in the hallway, the envelope from First Heritage Bank had slid through the mail slot and landed face up on the hardwood floor like a verdict already read. Helen was 44 years old. She had brown hair that had started going silver at the temples sometime during the year her husband died, and she had stopped fighting it because fighting small things felt wasteful when the large things were already winning. Her hands were rough from the land, from the fencing and the feeding and the early mornings that no one else showed up for anymore. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried at the funeral. She had not cried when the bank called the first time, or the second. But standing in the kitchen of the farmhouse her husband Tom had restored beam by beam over 11 years, holding a letter that told her she had 60 days to resolve a debt she did not fully understand, Helen felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold. Lily appeared in the doorway. She was 6 years old, had turned 6 in March, which meant the birthday cake had been store-bought because Helen had been too exhausted to bake. And she still felt guilty about that. Lily had Tom's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that looked different depending on the weather, and she was holding her stuffed rabbit, whose name changed every few weeks. This week it was Gerald. "Mama, Gerald wants pancakes," Lily announced. "Gerald will have to wait," Helen said, folding the letter without looking away from her daughter's face. She kept her voice even. She had become very good at keeping her voice even. "Gerald says that's not fair." "Gerald is right," Helen said. "Come here." She pulled Lily close and pressed her lips to the top of her head, breathing in the smell of sleep and children's shampoo. And she let herself stay there for exactly 10 seconds before she straightened up and put the letter in the kitchen drawer, where she kept things she needed to deal with later. There were already 3 other letters in that drawer. This was the 4th. The farm was called Red Birch, not by any official register, just by the family, because of the stand of river birch trees along the eastern fence line that turned deep red in October. 41 acres in central Kentucky, rolling and green, with a creek that ran through the lower pasture, and a barn that had been standing since 1931. Tom had found it when they were both 31 and had said, the moment he walked the property, that it was the place. Helen had thought he was being romantic. She had been wrong. He had been right, which was something that happened with Tom more often than she liked to admit. He died 22 months ago. A cardiac event, a polished way of saying his heart had simply stopped one morning in October while he was walking the fence line. And by the time Helen found him, the birch trees had already started turning. She had not gone back to that part of the property since. The debt was complicated in the way that only rural banking could be. Tom had taken a second loan 2 years before his death, a loan Helen had known about in the vague way that couples know about things they haven't fully read, brokered through a local businessman named Russell Kane, who sat on the board of First Heritage Bank and had made a second career out of being the kind of man people called when they needed a favor. Helen had met Russell twice. He had been friendly both times in a way she couldn't quite locate, a warmth that seemed to come from policy rather than feeling. After Tom died, the payments had continued for 14 months on schedule. Helen had managed it barely between the small income from the hay lease and the money she made doing bookkeeping remotely for a supply company in Lexington. Then a bad winter, a broken well pump that cost $4,000, a blight that took half the back pasture, and suddenly the payments weren't manageable anymore. She'd called the bank. She'd been told the loan had been restructured without her knowledge, restructured in a way she couldn't fully understand from the documents they sent, but that a local woman named Carol Vance, who was an attorney and the closest thing Helen had to a friend who knew the law, had described as not right. Carol had said she needed more time to look into it. That had been 6 weeks ago. The morning the truck appeared, Helen had been out at the barn since 5:30. The work didn't stop because the money did. The 2 horses still needed feeding. The chickens needed tending, and the section of eastern fence that had come down in last week's wind needed at least a temporary fix before the neighbor's cattle pushed through. She was on her knees in the mud next to the fence post, her hair pulled back and her jacket already showing a long tear on the left sleeve, when she heard the sound of gravel under tires. She stood up. The truck was a dark green, older, the kind of vehicle that looked like it had earned every dent. It came down the long drive at a measured pace, not slow enough to be hesitant, not fast enough to be aggressive, and parked 20 feet from the barn. The engine cut off. A man got out. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, tall in the way that read as natural rather than studied, with dark hair going gray and the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to waste movement. He wore a canvas work jacket and boots that had seen real use. He looked at the fence, then at Helen, and he did not smile in the way that men sometimes smiled at women alone on property, the smile that meant they were already calculating something. He simply looked and waited. "You're on private land," Helen said. "I know," he said. "My name is Richard Hale. Ernest Briggs sent me." Helen didn't move. Ernest Briggs was her neighbor to the north, a 70-year-old widower who ran cattle on the adjacent 200 acres and who had known Tom since they were both in their 20s. Ernest was not a man who sent strangers. "Ernest knows I'm looking for work," Richard said. "Fencing, mostly. I've also done roofing. Foundation work, well repair. He said you had a fence down and that you might need someone for longer than a day." He paused. "He also said you'd tell me to leave." Helen looked at him for a long moment. The fence post behind her had split at the base. The repair was a 2-person job or a 4-hour job for one very tired person. She had a drawer full of bank letters and a 6-year-old who wanted pancakes and a rabbit named Gerald, and the eastern pasture wasn't going to fix itself. "You eat breakfast?" she said. "I've had coffee," he said. "Then you can start on the fence," she said. "I'll bring something out at 8. He nodded once and walked to the back of his truck without another word. And Helen watched him for just a moment before she turned back toward the barn. She told herself she was measuring whether he knew what he was doing. She was not measuring anything else. Lily was awake when Helen came back inside, sitting at the kitchen table with Gerald propped against the sugar bowl and a very serious expression on her face. "Gerald says someone is in our yard," she said. "Gerald is correct," Helen said, pulling off her boots at the door. "His name is Richard. He's going to fix the fence." Lily considered this. "Does he like rabbits?" "Gerald can ask him himself," Helen said. And then, almost without meaning to, she looked out the kitchen window at the figure moving steadily along the fence line, working like someone who had done it 10,000 times before, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something cautious and small, and not yet named. She turned away from the window and started the pancakes. The fence took Richard less than 3 hours. He didn't ask for direction and he didn't make noise about the work. When Helen brought out coffee and a plate of toast at 8:15, Lily came with her still carrying Gerald, and stood at a careful distance watching the man work with the focused attention that 6-year-olds gave to things they had decided were worth understanding. "Are you good at fixing things?" Lily asked him. Richard looked at her without crouching down to her level, which Helen noticed. He didn't perform friendliness. "Mostly," he said. "Can you fix a zipper?" "Gerald's zipper is broken." "I can try," he said. Lily extended the rabbit toward him with great ceremony. Richard set down his tools, wiped his hands on his jacket, and spent 90 seconds with the small brass zipper on the rabbit's back, working it free of a caught thread with a patience that Helen found oddly difficult to look away from. He handed Gerald back. The zipper worked. Lily stared at it, then at him, with an expression of profound respect. "Thank you," she said, very seriously. "Welcome," he said, and picked up his tools again. Helen handed him the coffee without looking directly at him and said only that the rate Ernest had told him was fine, and that there was more work on the property if he wanted it. Richard drank the coffee and said he'd be back Friday. He left at noon. Helen stood at the kitchen window for a moment after his truck turned out of the drive and felt the silence of the farm settle back around her. Then she went to the drawer and took out the letter from the bank. She called Carol that afternoon. "I found something," Carol said before Helen could speak. Her voice had an edge to it, the specific edge of someone who has been reading documents for 6 straight hours and has found exactly what they hoped they wouldn't. "Russell Kane's name is on more than your loan, Helen. A lot more. I need another week, but I want you to know, what happened to your paperwork was not an accident." Helen stood very still in the kitchen. Through the window, the eastern fence line was straight and solid and repaired, and the late afternoon light came across the pasture in long gold sheets that made red birch look like it always had. Permanent, rooted, unassailable. The way Tom had always said it was. How bad? Helen said. Bad enough, Carol said. But maybe not too late. Helen hung up the phone. She looked at the fence for a long time, and then she looked at the place on the drive where a dark green truck had parked that morning, and she thought about a man who worked without wasting movement and fixed a stuffed rabbit's zipper with 90 seconds of patient attention. She did not know what was coming. None of them did. But something in the farm, in the repaired fence, in the fact that she had finally called Carol back, felt like the first day of something rather than the last. Outside, the birch trees moved in the early spring wind, and Helen Crawford stood in her kitchen and felt, for the first time in 22 months, like she was not entirely alone in whatever was coming next. Richard came back on Friday as he said he would, and then again the following Monday, and by the second week of April it had become a pattern without anyone agreeing to make it one. He arrived early, worked without needing direction, and left before dinner. Helen paid him in cash at the end of each week, which he accepted without counting, and she began to notice the particular rhythm of having someone else on the property. Not intrusive, not absent, just present in the way that land needs another person to be present. Steadily, usefully, without drama. She told herself it was convenient. The barn needed work on the south wall. The well pump that had broken in February had been replaced, but the housing around it was cracked, and left untended through another winter it would fail again. There was a section of roof on the equipment shed that had been patched badly 2 seasons ago and needed proper attention. These were real things. Richard could do them. That was the entirety of the arrangement. Lily had a different interpretation, which she expressed through Gerald. Gerald says the fixing man is nice, she reported one morning, watching from the kitchen window as Richard carried lumber from his truck to the barn. Gerald says he smells like wood. Gerald smells like you spilled apple juice on him last week, Helen said. Lily ignored this. Gerald wants to know if he's going to stay. He comes to work, Helen said. He doesn't stay. There's a difference. Lily gave her a look that, for a 6-year-old, contained a troubling amount of patience. Carol came to the farm on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of April. She drove a practical sedan and wore the expression she reserved for conversations she had been rehearsing in the car. She sat at Helen's kitchen table with a folder 3 inches thick and a cup of coffee she kept turning in her hands without drinking. I've verified 4 other properties, Carol said, all within a 30-mile radius, all with loans that were brokered through Russell Kane over the last decade, all with paperwork anomalies that are too consistent to be coincidence. She opened the folder. This is Dennis Calloway. He's worked at the county recorder's office for 11 years. He's also Russell Kane's cousin by marriage, which is not on his employment disclosure. Helen looked at the photographs. A slight man in his 50s with the colorless quality of someone who had spent decades trying not to be noticed. What did he do? He altered registration dates on land documents, Carol said. Not forgery exactly. More sophisticated than that. He had access to the filing system and knew exactly which stamps and records could be quietly adjusted without triggering audit flags. By shifting registration dates, Russell was able to manufacture default conditions on loans that weren't actually in default, essentially creating a legal pretext to call the loan early. Carol turned a page. Your loan was called 3 months before its actual restructuring date. The date on file shows otherwise. Helen was quiet for a moment. How many families? At least 5 that I can document, possibly more. The earliest case I found goes back 9 years. Carol closed the folder. Helen, he's been buying these properties through a holding company and reselling them to development interests. He made over $2 million on the last 3 transactions alone. The kitchen was very still. Outside, Helen could hear the distant sound of a hammer. Richard working on the equipment shed roof. The sound was steady and unhurried, the sound of work being done properly. Can we stop him? Helen said. I think so, Carol said. But I want to be careful about how. If we move too early, he lawyers up and buries the documents. We need more, and we need the right moment. She looked at Helen. Do you know anyone who has dealt with him before? Anyone outside the county who might have knowledge of his methods? Helen looked at the window. The hammering continued. I might, she said. She didn't ask Richard that evening. she asked him the next morning, when he came around the corner of the equipment shed and found her standing there with coffee for both of them, which had become a thing that happened now at mid-morning without being discussed. "Russell Kane," she said, without preamble. Richard took the coffee. Something in his face changed, not much. The kind of change you'd miss if you weren't watching. "What about him?" "Carol Vance, my attorney, thinks he's been running a land fraud scheme for the better part of a decade. She's documented 5 properties, including mine. The pattern involves someone at the recorder's office manipulating document dates." Helen looked at him. "Ernest told me you lost a farm." The silence lasted long enough to become a different kind of conversation. 8 years ago," Richard said. 47 acres in Harlan County. Livestock operation. Business partner. A loan I thought I understood." He drank the coffee, looking at a point above the tree line. The way people look when they're seeing something that's no longer there. "The loan got called. The documentation didn't match what I'd signed. By the time I understood it, the process had already moved too fast to stop. I got out with my son and a truck." He paused. "I didn't have anyone like your Carol. Was Russell Kane involved?" "I didn't know his name then," Richard said. "I know it now." Helen absorbed this. "How?" "Because 3 years after I lost the farm, I hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb to trace the holding company that bought my property. The trail ended at a subsidiary that Russell Kane controls through a development LLC registered in Tennessee." He looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. "I've been building a file on him for 5 years. The morning light was coming across the pasture at a low angle, the way it did in spring, and Helen felt something shift in the geometry of the last 3 weeks. All of it rearranging itself around this single fact, around the understanding that Richard Hale had not arrived at Red Birch by coincidence exactly, that Ernest had sent him for reasons that were larger than a broken fence, and that the man standing in front of her had been carrying the same weight she carried, only longer and alone. "Why didn't you say something?" she said. "Because I didn't know if you'd trust it," he said. "Someone shows up on your property and says he has a file on the man who's trying to take your farm. That's either useful or it's threatening, depending on what you think of the person saying it. I needed you to know me a little first." Helen looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look away. "Ernest could have told me," she said. "Ernest said you needed to see it yourself," Richard said. "He said you were the kind of person who needed to see." Helen looked down at her coffee. The farm was very quiet around them, the horses shifting in the barn, the early birds moving in the birch trees, Lily's voice from somewhere inside the house talking to Gerald about something important, the world working in its ordinary way. "I want to see the file," she said. Richard nodded. "I'll bring it Monday." He brought it Monday, and Carol came that evening, and the 3 of them sat at Helen's kitchen table long after Lily had gone to bed and went through it piece by piece. Marcus Webb's investigation had traced the holding company back through 4 shell entities to a Tennessee LLC with Russell Kane as the registered agent. There were records of property sales, transaction dates, development permits, a clean and patient paper trail that, laid beside Carol's documentation of the altered recorder's records, created something far more than suspicion. "This is enough to go to the state attorney general," Carol said. She was speaking quietly, the way lawyers speak when they find what they needed and are already thinking about what comes next. "But if we go too early, he moves the assets. He's done it before. The LLC structure is designed to be dismantled quickly." "Then we don't go to the AG first," Richard said. He had a specific manner when he talked about this, not cold, but focused, the way a person gets when something they've been carrying for a long time finally has a place to go. "We go at the moment he's most exposed, when he's in the act." Carol looked at him. "You have something in mind." "There's a property auction scheduled for the 18th of next month," Richard said. "The Alderman Farm over on Route 9. Harold Alderman is 73. Wife passed last year and his loan, I checked, is through the same brokered structure as Helen's. I'd bet my truck Russell Kane is positioned to buy it." Carol was already writing. "If we can document his presence at that auction as the acquiring party, and file the injunction simultaneously," Richard said. "And have a journalist in place," Carol said. She looked up. "I know someone. investigative reporter at the Courier-Journal who's been looking for a financial fraud story with a human face for 2 years. She looked at Helen. This is going to become public. Your name will be part of it. Helen was quiet for a moment. She thought about Tom, about the way he'd walked this land and said it was the place. She thought about Lily upstairs with Gerald, about the letters in the kitchen drawer, about the 31 days left on the bank's notice. Let it be public, she said. Let everyone see. Carol nodded. Richard looked at her with something careful and warm, the look of someone who recognizes something they didn't expect to find. Outside, the night was clear and the birch trees were dark against the stars. Not the quiet of waiting for something bad, but the quiet of something being built carefully in the dark, for the right moment. Helen Crawford looked at the papers on her kitchen table and felt the cold thing in her chest begin, very slowly, very quietly, to loosen. The plan had a shape now, and shape gave Helen something to work against. In the weeks since the kitchen meeting, she had learned that waiting with purpose was different from waiting with dread. That there was a quality of action even in stillness when the stillness was chosen. She still got up before 5. She still worked the fence line and the barn and the morning feeding. But now when she went inside and looked at the drawer with the bank letters, she felt less like a person standing at the edge of something and more like a person who had decided which direction to jump. Carol was in contact with the reporter, a woman named Sandra Hewitt who worked the investigative desk at the Courier-Journal, and who had, Carol said, the kind of professional patience that made her dangerous. Sandra had reviewed the documentation and said she needed 3 more weeks to independently verify the chain of corporate ownership before she could publish. 3 weeks was cutting close to the bank's deadline on Helen's property, but Carol had filed a motion challenging the loan call date, which had bought them a temporary stay, 47 days. It felt like a wall they were building brick by brick, not knowing if it would hold weight until they needed it to. Marcus Webb, Richard's investigator, had been brought back on and was running a secondary trace on Dennis Calloway's financial activity over the past decade. What he found, shared in a document that arrived by encrypted email on a Tuesday evening in early May, was grimmer than expected. Dennis had received irregular payments totaling over $60,000 from a private account linked to one of Russell Kane's shell companies. Not enough to be obvious, spread over 9 years in amounts that stayed below reporting thresholds. Patient, careful, and thoroughly documented once someone started looking. He's not just a cousin doing a favor, Carol said on the phone when Helen read her the summary. He was compensated. That changes the criminal exposure significantly. For Dennis or for Russell? Both. But more for Russell. Paying someone to alter public records is a different charge than having a relative do you a quiet favor. This is conspiracy. This is wire fraud. This potentially involves federal charges if we can show the scheme crossed state lines through the Tennessee LLC. Carol paused. Helen, if this holds together the way I think it does, Russell Kane is looking at serious federal time. Helen sat with that for a moment. Russell Kane, who had sat across from Tom at a closing table and shaken his hand. Russell Kane, who gave money to the county fairground renovation and whose name was on a plaque outside the 4-H building. Russell Kane, who had been quietly and methodically destroying families for a decade and calling it business. Good, she said. Richard had his own rhythm with the information, a steadiness that Helen had come to recognize as something other than detachment. He processed it internally and then showed up the next morning and fixed something. As if the physical work was how he translated the weight into something manageable. She understood that better than she wanted to admit. She'd been doing the same thing for 2 years. They had not talked again directly about what he'd told her in the morning by the equipment shed, about Harlan County, about his son Tommy and the truck and the tools. It had been said once and didn't need saying again. But it had changed the quality of the space between them. Not reduced it. There was still plenty of careful distance, the distance of 2 people who had both been badly hurt and had not forgotten how hurt felt. But it was a different distance now, less like separation and more like respect. Lily, characteristically, had her own assessment. Gerald says you smile more when the fixing man is here, she said one evening at dinner. Gerald talks a lot for a rabbit, Helen said. Gerald is observant, Lily said, with great dignity. She was 6 3/4 now, and she had recently developed the vocabulary of someone much older, which Helen suspected was the result of too many conversations she wasn't supposed to be following. Gerald also says the fixing man looks at you when you're not looking. Eat your green beans. Gerald doesn't like green beans. Gerald, Helen said, is not the one I'm talking to. Lily ate her green beans with the expression of someone conceding a minor point while winning the larger argument. And Helen looked out the window at the long evening light on the pasture and did not allow herself to think about whatever it was that her 6-year-old and her 6-year-old's rabbit were apparently tracking with great interest. The evening she finally talked to Ernest Briggs about it was a Thursday in mid-May. She drove over to return a tractor part she'd borrowed in February, and Ernest had been on the porch with iced tea, which he offered with the calm of a man who had been expecting her. "You knew about his farm," she said, without sitting down. "I knew," Ernest said. "And you knew about Russell Kane." "I suspected," Ernest said. "I didn't have what you have now, but I knew Richard had spent a long time looking into something, and when I heard what was happening to you it seemed like God's own timing or a coincidence so large it amounted to the same thing." He looked at her with the frank affection of someone who had watched her family for 30 years. "I should have told you before I sent him." "Yes," Helen said. "You would have said no." She sat down. The porch faced west, and the light was going gold and long across Ernest's pasture, the same light that came across red birch this time of evening, and for a moment she could hear Tom in the quality of the silence, his particular way of sitting in evening light without needing to fill it. "He talked to me about Harlan County," she said. "The farm. What happened?" Ernest nodded. He didn't ask what Richard had said. He seemed to understand that what mattered wasn't the content but the fact of it, that Richard had said it at all. "He's a careful man," Ernest said. "He doesn't give things away quickly. In 8 years of knowing him, I've watched him hold everything at arm's length." He paused. "Right up until he found out what was happening to you. Then he wasn't particularly careful about whether I knew he cared." Helen looked at the pasture for a while. A hawk was working a thermal above the far tree line, turning in slow, patient circles. "I'm not in a position to," she started. "Nobody's asking you to be," Ernest said. "Least of all him. He knows what you're carrying. He carried the same thing." He turned the glass in his hands. "Sometimes the most a person can do is just be in the same place as someone else. That's not nothing." Helen drove home in the long dusk with the windows down and the smell of Kentucky spring coming in, turned earth and new grass and the sweetness of the locust trees along the road. And she let herself feel, without deciding what to do with it, the warmth of knowing that someone understood the specific weight she carried. Not from outside it, from inside it, from the same place. Lily was already in bed when she got home, and Gerald was on the pillow next to her with the repaired zipper facing up, which was how Lily always placed him. Helen stood in the doorway for a moment watching her daughter sleep. 6 years old, with Tom's eyes and her own stubbornness and a rabbit named Gerald, and a future that was still right now contingent on things outside this room. Helen went to the kitchen. She opened the drawer and took out all 4 letters and put them on the table. She read each one carefully the way she should have read them in the first place. Then she stacked them neatly and left them out where she could see them. The auction at the Alderman farm was in 12 days. She went to the window. The birch trees were dark shapes against the lighter dark of the sky, and the farm was very quiet. Somewhere to the east a dog barked twice and stopped, and the night settled. 12 days, Helen thought. She had waited 22 months and she could wait 12 more days. And then Russell Kane was going to discover what happened when the people he had been taking apart quietly, one property at a time, decided not to be quiet anymore. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the farm breathe around her, and she felt, down in the deep still place where the cold thing had been, something that was not quite hope and not quite certainty, but was somewhere between the two. A readiness, clean and clear as groundwater, that had been building in her without her permission for weeks. She let it be there. Outside, the birch trees moved in the late wind, and red birch held its ground the way it always had, the way it was going to keep doing, because Helen Crawford had decided that it would. And in 12 days, everyone was going to know it. The 18th arrived the way important days often do, ordinary on the surface, with the same gray morning light and the same birds in the birch trees and Lily eating cereal at the kitchen table, and asking Gerald whether he thought today was a good day. Gerald, apparently, thought it was. Helen stood at the counter with her coffee and watched the clock and tried to breathe like a person who was not about to participate in something that could go very wrong. Richard had been at the farm since 6. He was wearing a button-down shirt instead of his work jacket, which Lily noticed immediately. "You look different," she told him. "I have a meeting today," he said. Lily considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Gerald says you should wear the blue one next time. Blue is better." "I'll keep that in mind," Richard said, and Lily accepted this with a satisfied nod and went back to her cereal. Carol arrived at 7:30. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer and carried the leather bag she brought to court. Compact, efficient, chosen for function. She spread her materials on the kitchen table. The injunction documents, already drafted and waiting for the right moment to file, the verified chain of corporate records, and a printed copy of the communication she'd had the previous evening with the clerk at the Harlan County Courthouse, who had confirmed that the original deed of sale on Richard's former property bore a registration stamp that, under closer examination, showed signs of alteration consistent with the pattern Carol had documented in the other 4 cases. "That makes 6, Carol said. 6 properties, 9 years, 1 man." She looked at Richard. "Your farm is in the file now." Richard looked at the document for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not satisfaction exactly, something older and more complicated than satisfaction. And then he folded it and placed it carefully in the inside pocket of his jacket. "Then let's finish it," he said. Sandra Hewitt had been in position since the night before. She was staying at a motel 12 miles from the auction site and had spent the previous 48 hours doing what she called final verification, which meant confirming, through a source inside First Heritage Bank, who had decided that his proximity to Russell Kane's activities was a liability he could no longer afford, that Russell had directed the bank to position the Alderman property for acquisition through the Tennessee LLC. The source had provided internal communications. Sandra had them on her laptop, verified and time-stamped. She called Carol at 8:15. "I'm good to go," she said. "Story is ready to publish the moment you give me the word." "We give you the word when the gavel falls," Carol said. "Understood." The Alderman farm auction was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the property itself, a common practice for rural land sales in the county, the kind of thing that drew a crowd of neighbors and interested parties and people who came mostly to watch. Harold Alderman had lived on that land for 40 years. People knew him. People would be there. Helen was not going. That had been a deliberate decision, made the week before with Carol's agreement. Helen's presence at the auction of a neighboring property, given what was coming, could be read as confrontational, could alert Russell's people, could give someone a reason to delay or restructure. Her role was here, at Red Birch, near the phone, waiting. She hated it. She understood it. "You're the anchor," Carol had said. "This all radiates out from what happened to you. When it's over, everyone will know that. But today you stay on the land." So Helen stayed on the land. She did the morning feeding. She repaired a section of chicken wire that had been sagging for a week. She came inside at 9:30 and washed her hands and stood at the kitchen window and watched the birch trees and thought about Tom, who would have said something steady and practical and right, something she could hold on to, and she tried to construct what that might have been. She thought he would have said, "You did the work. Now let the work do what it does." Richard's truck left at 8:45. Carol followed 5 minutes later. Lily, who was home from school with a mild cold that had appeared at exactly the right moment or at exactly the worst moment depending on how you looked at it, was on the couch with Gerald and a blanket and a cartoon on the television, and she looked up as Helen came back inside. "Is today the day the bad man gets in trouble?" she asked. Helen stopped. "What do you know about that?" Lily gave her a patient look. "Mama, I'm 6. Not a baby." Helen sat down on the edge of the couch. She looked at her daughter, the gray-green eyes, the particular set of her jaw that was all Tom, and felt something sharp and clean move through her chest. "Yes," she said. "Today is that day." Lily nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already worked out. She turned back to her cartoon, and then turned back one more time. "Gerald says it's going to be okay." "Gerald is very smart," Helen said. "I know. Lily said, entirely seriously. At 9:58. Carol texted, in position. Russell is here. Everything is in place. Helen stood in the kitchen with her phone in her hand and the autumn light. Real autumn now, the first real week of it, the birch trees just beginning to turn at the tips, coming through the window, and she breathed and she waited. At 10:22 the text came. Done. It's done. Call you in 10 minutes. Helen put the phone down on the counter. She walked to the kitchen window. She pressed her palm flat against the glass the way she had pressed it against the table on the Tuesday the letter arrived, and she felt the cold of it. And the solidity. And she stood there for a long time while the birch trees moved in the October wind, and red birch breathed around her, and Lily's cartoon played in the other room. And she let herself, carefully, in small increments, the way you let something go that you've been holding very tightly for a very long time. She let herself believe that it was going to be all right. Carol called at 10:31. Her voice was the voice of someone who had just done the thing they had been building toward for months, steady and clean and slightly undone at the edges. The injunction was filed at 10:17, Carol said. Sandra's story went live at 10:19. The sheriff's deputy arrived at 10:22. Russell Kane was escorted from the auction in front of approximately 60 people, most of whom have known him for 30 years. A pause. He didn't say anything. He just went quiet, like someone had unplugged something. Helen said nothing for a moment. Harold Alderman? Standing in his front yard watching, Carol said. His daughter was there. She was holding his hand. Another pause. Helen. The bank called already, 15 minutes after the story went up. They're withdrawing the enforcement action on your property pending a review of all loans brokered through Kane. Their lawyers are already throwing him under every available vehicle. Helen pressed her palm harder against the glass. Outside, a single red leaf came off one of the birch trees and turned in the air for a moment before it fell. It's not over, Helen said. Not completely. No, Carol said. But the thing that was going to take your farm, that's over. Helen stayed at the window for a long time after she hung up. Then she went into the living room and sat on the couch next to Lily and Gerald and the blanket and the cartoon, and Lily looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said, Well? Gerald was right, Helen said. Lily nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had never doubted it. The weeks after the auction moved differently than the weeks before, slower in some ways, faster in others, the way time moves when the thing you've been dreading is replaced by the thing you've been hoping for, and you discover that hope has its own particular weight. Russell Kane was arraigned on 5 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud in a federal proceeding 23 days after the auction. Dennis Calloway, whose name Sandra's article had published in full alongside the documented payments, had retained a lawyer by the afternoon of the auction day and began cooperating with federal investigators within the week. His cooperation, Carol said, was thorough, the kind of thorough that suggested a man who had spent 9 years waiting to be caught and had been quietly relieved when it finally happened. The bank's internal review expanded rapidly once the federal investigation opened. 3 additional loan files came under scrutiny. 2 more families who had lost properties in previous years were identified as potential victims of the scheme and notified by investigators. The Tennessee LLC was frozen by court order. Russell Kane's personal accounts were blocked pending the investigation. He had lost the thing Carol had predicted he would lose most: the reputation of a respectable man. In a county where reputation was the currency that made everything else work, that loss moved through the community faster and more thoroughly than any legal proceeding could. The plaque outside the 4-H building was quietly removed by the board. His name disappeared from the fairground renovation acknowledgement panel. People who had called him a friend found other words for what he had been. Helen watched all of this from red birch. She paid attention to it because it mattered. Because it was real. Because 6 families had had their lives altered by what Russell Kane had done, and the accounting of that deserved to be witnessed. But she found, as the days passed, that the story she was living most attentively was a smaller and quieter one, happening in the ordinary hours of the farm. Richard had stayed. Not in any formal sense. He was not living at Red Birch. He had his own place 30 minutes north, a rental property that he described once without elaboration as sufficient. But he came to the farm 4 or 5 days a week, and the nature of what he came for had shifted without either of them naming the shift. The equipment shed roof was finished. The barn wall was solid. The well housing had been properly repaired and would survive another winter. There were always other things that needed doing. There always were, on a working farm. But the work was no longer the reason, or not entirely, and both of them knew it and neither of them said so. And this arrangement felt to Helen both precarious and exactly right. Tommy came to the farm for the first time on a Saturday in late October. He was 14, with his father's height and a reserve that had clearly been learned rather than inherited, the careful stillness of a boy who had been through something and had built a perimeter around it. He got out of Richard's truck and looked at the farm the way Richard always looked at new places, taking inventory before committing to an expression. Lily met him at the fence. "I'm Lily," she said. "This is Gerald." She extended the rabbit. Tommy looked at Gerald. He looked at Lily. Something in his carefully maintained reserve shifted just slightly. "What happened to his ear?" he said. One of Gerald's ears had developed a small tear along the seam in the past week. "He had an accident," Lily said gravely. "I can fix that," Tommy said. Helen, watching from the porch, saw Richard look at his son and then look away, quickly the way you look away from something that is too direct to hold. She understood that. She looked away too. Tommy did fix the ear, using a needle and thread from Helen's sewing kit, with a concentration and a patience that was so precisely his father's that it was almost difficult to watch. Lily supervised with great seriousness and provided a running commentary that Tommy absorbed without complaint. And when it was done, he handed Gerald back and Lily inspected the repair with the critical eye of a quality assessor before announcing her verdict. "Better than before?" she said. "Good," Tommy said. He spent the afternoon helping Richard rehang a gate that had been listing for weeks, and Helen brought them both sandwiches at noon. And when she came back to the porch, she found Ernest Briggs had driven over without calling first, which was his occasional custom, and was sitting in the chair he always chose as if he'd been there for hours. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Helen said honestly. Ernest nodded. He looked at Richard and Tommy working on the gate, at the easy competence of it, at the way they moved around each other without needing to speak. "Tom would have liked him," Ernest said. "I know," Helen said. She had known that for a while. Tom would have said something about it being time. Tom, Helen said, would have been insufferable about it. Ernest laughed, a real, full laugh that startled the dog sleeping under the porch. And Helen laughed too, and for a moment the farm felt like it always had on good days, full and real and lit from within. That evening, after Tommy and Richard had left and Lily was in bed with Gerald and his repaired ear, Helen sat at the kitchen table with the letters, not the bank letters, which were in Carol's files now, evidence in a federal case now, but Tom's letters. The ones he'd written her in the early years when he traveled for work, and writing letters was the thing he did instead of calling, because he said calling left too much unsaid. She kept them in a wooden box on the shelf, and she hadn't opened the box in 22 months, and tonight she had. She didn't read them all. She read 3. She sat with them in the kitchen of the house Tom had built, and let herself feel, without managing it, the full weight of missing him. Not the sharp daily grief of the first months that had softened, as it does, into something more habitual and more profound, but the specific grief of knowing that a person is gone who understood you at a depth that cannot be replaced, only, if you are very fortunate, approximated in time by someone new. She put the letters back in the box. She put the box back on the shelf. She went to the window. The birch trees were stripped down now. October had taken most of the leaves, and the bare branches caught the starlight and held it in a way that was different from summer, starker and more honest. The farm was very quiet. Helen thought about Richard. She thought about what Ernest had said. She thought about Tommy fixing Gerald's ear with his father's hands, and about the way Richard had looked at his son in that moment, and about 2 people who had been broken by different versions of the same loss, and had arrived, by accident, and by Ernest Briggs's specific and meddling kindness, at the same fence line. She was not ready for everything. She knew that. There were things inside her that still needed time and distance before they could be handed to anyone else. But she was, she thought, ready for something. some next thing. She was ready to stop standing at the window and start moving toward it. She would tell him tomorrow. And then the phone rang. An unfamiliar number, a Kentucky area code she didn't recognize. And when she answered, the voice on the other end was a woman's, low and careful, and it said, "Mrs. Crawford? My name is Janet Alderman, Harold's daughter. I need to tell you something about the night before my father's auction. Something about Russell Kane that isn't in any of the documents." A pause. Something I've been afraid to say until now. Helen stood very still in the kitchen. "Tell me," she said. And outside, in the bare October trees, the wind moved through red birch like something about to break open into whatever came next. Janet Alderman came to the farm on a Tuesday morning, which Helen now associated with things that changed the shape of what came after. She was in her mid-40s, a compact and serious woman who had driven 2 hours from Louisville and arrived holding a manila envelope with the careful grip of someone transporting something fragile. They sat at the kitchen table, Helen, Janet, and Carol, who Helen had called the moment she'd hung up the night before. Richard was at the farm but stayed outside, working, giving the room the space it needed. Lily was at school. "The night before the auction," Janet said, "Russell Kane came to our house. My father's house." She set the envelope on the table but didn't open it yet. "Daddy didn't tell me until after the auction, after everything happened. He was ashamed. He'd thought for a long time, that maybe he could have stopped it, that he should have made different choices." Her voice was steady in the way that people's voices are steady when they have been practicing steadiness for weeks. "Russell came to the door at 9 in the evening. He told my father that if he didn't withdraw from the auction process and deed the property directly to the holding company at a fixed price, a price 40% below market, he would release information to the county about a tax irregularity from 12 years ago. Something my father had done wrong, not dramatically wrong, a recording error that had worked in his favor and that he'd never corrected. Russell had documentation. He'd been holding it for years." The kitchen was quiet. Carol was writing. "That's extortion," Carol said. "Yes," Janet said. She finally opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies, documents her father had kept methodically in a lockbox in his bedroom, the way that men of his generation kept things they were afraid of and could not bring themselves to destroy. Daddy kept everything. The note Russell left. The documentation Russell showed him, he kept copies of it all. She pushed the documents across the table. "I think he always knew somewhere that someday someone would need to see it." Helen looked at the documents. She looked at Russell Kane's handwriting. Neat, unhurried. The handwriting of a man who had been doing this long enough to do it without anxiety. She thought about all the evenings that man had spent in the homes of people who trusted him. Laying out the terms of a transaction they didn't understand was a trap. "There are others," Janet said. "I've spoken to 2 other families since the article came out. Families who lost property in the past. Both of them received visits like this, not always extortion, sometimes just pressure. Sometimes manufactured urgency around a manufactured deadline. One family was told their water rights were in dispute when they weren't. Another was told the county was planning a road expansion that would bisect their land. All of it lies. All of it designed to make them feel the ground shifting under them until they sold." Carol looked at Helen. Helen looked at Carol. "How many families total?" Helen said. "With what Janet has brought us and the 2 she's identified, at least 9, Carol said. 9 properties over 10 years. She was calculating something, the way she calculated when the numbers were becoming something prosecutorial rather than civil. The federal case just grew considerably. Carol left at noon to call the assistant U.S. attorney who had taken over the investigation. Janet stayed for coffee. They sat at the table after the documents had been photographed and cataloged and set aside, and Janet looked around the kitchen, at the wooden box on the shelf, at the photographs on the wall, at the general quality of a house that had been lived in by people who cared about it, and said, "Your farm is beautiful." "It is," Helen said. "It almost wasn't. My father wants to keep his," Janet said. "He's 73, and he wants to die on the land his wife is buried on. After everything, after what Russell tried to do, that's still what he wants. He should get to," Helen said. "Because of you," Janet said. Because of what you started. Helen shook her head. Because of what Carol found. Because of what Richard built for 5 years. Because of Sandra Hewitt and a bank insider and your father keeping documents in a lockbox. She looked at Janet. I just didn't sell. Sometimes, Janet said. That's everything. Richard came in for coffee at 1 o'clock after Janet had left. He poured his own cup and leaned against the counter and listened while Helen told him what Janet had brought. He listened the way he always listened. Completely. Without interruption. With that particular stillness that she had stopped finding unreadable and had come to understand as the thing he did when he was treating information with the respect it deserved. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 9 families, he said. At least. He looked at his coffee. I used to think, he said slowly, that if I could just prove what happened to my farm, just get the documentation in front of someone who could do something with it, that it would fix something in me, that the thing that broke when I lost it would go back together. He looked up. It doesn't work like that. No, Helen said. It doesn't. But it's still worth doing, he said. It's worth doing because Harold Alderman gets to stay on his land, because those 9 families get to know what was done to them, because Russell Kane doesn't get to be a respectable man anymore. He paused. The thing in me that broke, that's a different problem. That's mine to work on. Helen looked at him for a long moment across the kitchen. I know something about broken things that take time, she said. I know you do, he said. The silence between them was different from the early silences. Not guarded, not measuring, not the silence of 2 people deciding how much to give away. It was the silence of 2 people who had already given quite a lot away, and were standing in the space that created, figuring out what came next. I'm going to stay in Kentucky, Richard said. I've been thinking about it for a while. I was going to leave. I had the idea that once the Kane thing was resolved, I'd go somewhere that didn't have the weight of the farm on it. But, he stopped. But, Helen said. But the weight isn't geographic, he said. I worked that out a while ago. He looked at her with the directness that she had over months come to trust completely. And there are things here I don't want to leave. Helen looked at her coffee cup. She thought about Tom's letters in the wooden box on the shelf, and about what she had decided at the window the night before Janet's call had redirected the morning. She thought about Lily and Gerald and a needle and thread and a boy with his father's hands who had made something torn whole again. Lily thinks you should wear blue, she said. Something in his face changed. The thing that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. The expression she had been watching arrive incrementally over 7 months and that she had stopped pretending not to notice. I'll take that under advisement, he said. Gerald agrees with her, Helen said. I'd hate to go against Gerald, he said. The kitchen was warm and the birch trees outside were bare against the November sky. And Helen Crawford stood in the house that Tom had built and felt, fully, without reservation, without the managed distance she had maintained for 2 years. The specific and ordinary miracle of being in a place you love with people you have chosen. Not healed, not finished, not without the shape of what she had lost. But here, alive, ready. 3 months later, Russell Kane pled guilty to 7 federal counts in a plea agreement that his attorney described to the press as the most favorable terms available under the circumstances, which was another way of saying there were no favorable terms and everyone knew it. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Dennis Calloway received 18 months and a permanent bar from public employment. The Tennessee LLC was dissolved, its assets liquidated and placed in a restitution fund administered by the court. Carol filed civil suits on behalf of 4 of the 9 families. 2 properties that had been sold under the scheme were recovered through litigation. Harold Alderman's farm was cleared of all encumbrances. He was present in the courtroom the day the judgment was entered, 73 years old, in a good suit, with Janet beside him and a look on his face that Helen, who was also in the courtroom, recognized completely. The look of a person who has been told by a legal process and a public record that what was done to them was real, was wrong, and will not be done again. She drove home from the courthouse on a cold February afternoon with the fields brown on either side of the road, and the sky the particular flat white of an overcast midwinter day, and she felt for the entire drive nothing dramatic, just the steady, solid, ordinary feeling of a person returning to a place that is theirs. Richard's truck was in the drive when she got home. Lily was at the fence before Helen had the car door open. "Gerald says today was important," Lily said. "Gerald is correct," Helen said. "Gerald wants to know if you're okay." Helen crouched down to her daughter's level and looked at her face. Tom's eyes, her own stubbornness, 6 years and 10 months old, holding the rabbit with the repaired ear and the repaired zipper, standing in front of the farm that was going to be hers someday when Helen was done with it. "Tell Gerald," Helen said, "that I'm better than okay." Lily considered this with great seriousness. Then she nodded, satisfied, and turned toward the house. "Gerald says good," she reported. "Gerald says it's about time." Helen stood up. She looked at the birch trees along the eastern fence line, bare in February, but she could see the beginning of buds on the closest branches, the first suggestion of what was coming, the quiet and inevitable return of things that had only been dormant. She looked at Richard in the doorway of the barn, watching her with that steady, patient expression that she had stopped trying not to love. She walked toward the barn. The ground was solid under her feet. The farm breathed around her the way it always had, the way it was always going to, and red birch held its ground in the February light, rooted and real and hers, the way Tom had always said it would be. He had been right. He had always been right about the things that mattered. And now it was her turn.